today's World Insight. New year, new beginnings for China-U.S. relations. What's in store for bilateral ties in 2024?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. China and the United States celebrate the 45th anniversary of formal diplomatic relations early this year. Peace, cooperation, and win-win policy, these are arguably the cornerstone of the relationship between China and the U.S. So much so that Chinese Foreign Minister Wang says peaceful engagement is not just an option, but an imperative for the world's most consequential bilateral relations. But with quite complicated ties, how do both sides manage the year 2024? To answer that question, I talked to two people in the know. Take a look at our conversation. For the latest discussion on China-U.S. relations in Beijing, Ben Harburg, Director of National Committee of U.S.-China Relations and also Managing Partner of MSA. In San Francisco, Da Wei, Professor and Senior Fellow of the Center for International Strategy and Security with Tsinghua University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I'm so glad that we have a switch of locations between the two of you.
Yes, that shows the communication of the two countries we have recovered.
I'm so glad to hear that. And hopefully we have more American guests in Beijing, isn't it, Ben?
It's beautiful here. It's crisp, clear, blue skies in the middle of winter.
Yeah, well, over the weekend, the 45th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the United States is being celebrated, especially from the Chinese side. We heard from the Director and Foreign Minister Wang talking about these relations, but this celebration is being done at a time when the United States is entering into its presidential election year. So Ben, what do you make of this interesting combination?
We might have seen peak U.S.-China relations. Obviously, we had a pretty positive bilateral summit at the APEC in the fall, and some exuberance today. But I suspect that there's reason to be pessimistic over the coming months as we enter a U.S. election cycle where each one of the political parties will try to outdo the other and try to prove it was harder on China than the other. So we might have reached the apex this weekend.
So, Professor Da, it seems that Mr. Harburg is trying to warn us about the turbulence ahead.
I agree with Ben that probably we will see some turbulence this year because of the campaign. Having said that, I don't think we have to be too pessimistic. I mean, campaign year, of course, is always difficult for China-U.S. relations, particularly for the candidates who want to show they are hawkish, they are headline to China. But on the one hand, I think it's almost, most of that will be the rhetorics rather than policy. I think it's very important for China side. How does Chinese side respond to that rhetoric? If you respond that, word by word, I think that we will see more turbulence. But if you just tend to ignore it, probably it won't be so serious. And at the same time, I think the campaign year probably mean the current administration won't be able to stage out any major policy towards China.
Takes two to tango, isn't it? It is important to implement the San Francisco consensus, as two sides have been talking about, which is the kinds of areas of cooperation and the establishment of communications between the two sides agreed upon by the two presidents last year in San Francisco. Ben, so far, what do you think about the nature of these implementations and the results at this moment?
We've seen an opening of that mill-to-mill dialogue, which had been closed following Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Maybe some other opening of channels critical to establish those guardrails and red lines for the relationship, critical to establish points where we feel there be open communication channels, particularly as we face challenging conditions in the South China Sea and other areas where incidents do happen, accidents do happen, and so it appears that some of those channels have reopened, and that bodes positively for some of those kind of extreme red zone areas.
I think besides what Ben have said, which I totally echo, I think we have seen some developments on the people-to-people exchanges area. The two countries are increasing their flights across the two countries. I think the airfare, traveling to the U.S. and vice versa will probably be lower, I think. And also, I think, at least on China side, I think Chinese government and its related agencies, including universities I work for, are working for the plan raised by President Xi in San Francisco to invite 50,000 American students to visit China. I think the Chinese government are working hard on that. They are starting to do that. So we will see that happen in the coming months and years.
Over the weekend, at the celebration ceremony in which the Chinese foreign minister spoke about the relationship, there was the students coming from the University of Virginia, also students coming from Columbia University there, a lot of shining and smiling faces over there. And over the weekend, Professor Das, you are from Tsinghua University. I understand there was a ping pong game, following the tradition of the relations being held.
Actually, I met the Columbia University students delegation before I flew to San Francisco. But because of this flight, I missed the UVA delegation of the ping pong game. But I'm happy to see some of them in Tsinghua. They're actually the day before I leave, and that's the Columbia University students. And I'm also happy to see the UVA delegation on the news and also in the reception that you mentioned.
And I heard they have very good doubles, with the Chinese and American students teamed up against their other pairs. It was quite interesting. Ben, of course, all these stories are familiar to your ears, but to what extent can we understand this people-to-people interaction, especially the 50,000 American students likely to be in China traveling in the year 2024?
Yeah, it's obviously something we've championed, and as a director in the national committee that really, opened the ping pong diplomacy up between China and the U.S. And we reiterated the call for this at our gala dinner, which was one of the last public appearances that Dr. Kissinger made just a few months ago. And at that dinner, we had Yao Ming, we had Tracy McGrady, an American and Chinese basketball players speaking about their time together and what they learned from each other. So clearly these sports and people-to-people exchanges are critical. The challenge we face today is not, I think, China's willingness to make visas available for, say, 50,000 U.S. students. It's the willingness of those 50,000 students to get on a plane and come to China. And the narrative and rhetoric is so negative on the U.S. side that I think that there's a huge aversion to coming to China at this point, both for ideological as even the security reasons that are espoused in Western media, and that keeps people off the planes in spite of the willingness on this side, and that will ultimately undermine our ability as Americans to have kind of a deep bench of students and researchers and academics that understand China. There have been op-eds written just over the last few days that said, where are all the American China experts? Where have they all gone? And if they're gone today, imagine what it'll be like in the coming decades as we have just a few hundred American students here in China. So a long way to go to convince Americans to come here.
You talk about an important issue, which is the rhetorics and the narratives. I remember the Chinese foreign minister in his speech also touched upon that. He regarded that as echo chambers of fake news and misinformation. Now, to a certain extent, that is really true. But tell me more, Mr. Harburg, about what exactly have you found about the nature of these narratives, of these rhetorics?
So the rhetoric exists on both sides, and I think that some of it is also due not just to negative narratives that have been developed and fostered in the West, and particularly out of the U.S., but also a lot of national news organizations don't have a representative sitting here physically in Beijing. Obviously, COVID made that harder. And so a lot are reporting remotely or reporting from third-party sources. But the net result of that is there is a certain political as well as economic contingent in markets like the U.S. That for various reasons, maybe on the economic side, that they're seeing incumbent interests challenged by upstart Chinese technology, consumer, hardware, software businesses, as well as obviously on the political side, where they see ideological challenges and a rising China taking its seat at the table of multilateral organizations, displacing U.S. interests or power in certain geographies, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, elsewhere. And so there's significant pushback against that, and a negative narrative goes a long way to dissuading both individuals as well as governments and corporations from doing business in China. And I've spoken with many business leaders that have remarked about how effective that disinformation campaign has been. And so it's critical that we open those doors, China open those doors.
And Professor Da, I'm sure you are also thinking about similar issues at this point, but what might be the solutions?
I think, first of all, I have to say, yes, those rhetorics are important, but rhetorics, they do have, they are related to the facts or related to the policy. I want to say, it's not, we just have some fake news or we just have rhetoric totally groundless. I think we have to be honest that our two countries have a lot of differences, no matter our policies or our institutions. Admitting that, I think it's important for the two countries to talk to each other and to let the people to travel safely and in a dignified way. I think that's a responsible way to handle the differences. And by doing that, we can at least minimize, we can reduce some of the differences, some of the those rhetorics. I think that's what we can do. We do have difference, but because of that, we need those communication more. We need those reporters, journalists, we need tourists, we need scholars, students to travel to each other. I think this is extremely important.
But the question is whether those differences will lead us, China and the U.S., to confrontations. That is a question urgently need to be asked.
We have to admit that our two countries have a lot of differences, no matter in policy and our institutions and even values. We have differences. But does that difference mean we need to have confrontation? We have to have confrontation or even conflict? Or does that influence necessarily leads to the reality that we only have hundreds of American students study in China? I think no. I think that's too much. I think we have differences. You can say we are competitor. You can say we are adversary. But even if that's true, probably that's not true. But even if that's true, I do think we still need to first communicate to each other, talk to each other. Secondly, manage the differences to prevent the worst scenario. I think after the San Francisco summit, we have a chance to build a new normal that is, to manage this tension between the two countries and try to control the differences of the two countries. I think we have the opportunity this year before the election. But of course, the U.S. election is a big uncertainty.
Ben, do you agree with what Wei just said?
I think we have to be realists and acknowledge that this relationship in many ways is irreparably broken. It cannot go back to kind of the halcyon days, maybe 2008. I think the best we can hope for today is some kind of a managed competition, a place that has, as I said, guardrails, and is a clear combative arena when it comes to business, when it comes to influence, politically, soft power, whatever it may be, and one that, but one that has what we maybe call organized or predictable decoupling, because I see only a continuation and acceleration of this decoupling and deglobalization that we enjoyed for many decades. And instead a world where there will be balkanization, there will be lines drawn, there will be spheres of political and economic influence. I think hopefully today we can find ourselves in a more predictable environment that at least business and political leaders can point to, and investors and consumers can understand, to enable us to feel that that is a more streamlined and managed process. But overall, I think it's going to be challenging to do much more than collaborate on the key kind of issues facing humanity, be it climate change, some disease management, global, political instability. Those might find some shared purpose, but otherwise it will be a continued divergence.
How do we see the nature of doing business now, especially when the two economies are at different stages?
All parties sharing blame. I think certainly on the Chinese side, there's been a high degree of unpredictability around the regulation of technology, particularly, but also its interventions into what we're seeing as kind of independent and relatively thriving sectors. We've had external forces or kind of unpredictable forces, the likes of the real estate sector collapse, really challenging a lot of the fundamentals in China. We've married that with overall a Chinese growth evolution, which is highly compressed by global standards. And so when global investors have experienced kind of unbridled Chinese growth going from the late 1990s, where we were at 16%, to today, where we're probably closer to 5% year-on-year GDP growth, that really shocks investors. All of that has combined for a very complicated picture today in China, and in some ways of its own making, but in some ways unavoidable, just given the accelerated growth that we've seen across these markets. And so we enter 2024 with cautious optimism that we can get off of some of the lows that we're facing here on many of the kind of marquee names that have been seen as litmus tests for all of the Chinese economy, the likes of Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, but will require continued Chinese regulatory support, stimulus, lack of intervention in the market, predictability, and more kind of forecasting and foreshadowing around what they're doing, and then that managed competition with the West, where they sit at the table to ensure that there are more predictable interventions from the U.S. side, rather than these rapid executive orders, which struck fear into the hearts of many of China's largest technology companies and, of course, their investors.
So I think the most important thing is, the domestic economic development in respective two countries. I mean, for example, if China's domestic economy grow very rapidly in the future, and if its market become more attractive to the Western American business, the community, I think then maybe probably in the future the situation may change. But if the market here is less attractive, I think the American companies, American business community may feel this organized, to use Ben's word, organized decoupling is in their best interest. But if this market is, we say the dual circulation, right? If you have those dual circulation very healthy, then the American company may find that decoupling with China is not in their interest. So until then, probably we may see some different situation. But along current trajectory, I will say yes, we are towarding this managed decoupling or selective decoupling. But again, I have to emphasize is we need to maintain the necessary and the minimal contact with each other. And for example, we need to make trade as normal.
What do you make of, whether there is much, transparency and also information regarding the real state of business between the two countries?
I think we have pretty good data, particularly obviously related to trade flows, capital coming in and out. So when you have edicts, even as recently as the gaming edict, and then going back in time, the likes of interventions into Alibaba, actions taken against the education technology sector, the delisting or the forced delisting of Didi, these types of actions against hallmark, brand name blue chip companies, again, that are seen as bellwethers for the Chinese economy, are looked at very closely by global investors. And I've certainly made my case to the Chinese regulators that they should do a better job of making global investors understand the rationale for decisions taken and given as much advance warning as possible. And again, I think these are growing pains. Going back to my compression of the growth story of China, all the financial regulatory infrastructure wasn't in place to regulate these businesses, let alone communicate why the regulation had taken place. And so I think this is a natural growing pain of an economy that went from 0 to 100 in just a few years and is falling back down to more modest, mature market levels of growth. And then, of course, on the U.S. side, to spend time to really understand the market and not make snap judgments, not write news pieces that generalize rather than really spend time thinking intimately about the conditions here. And so it's certainly two have to play the game, but I think China can start by doing a better job on the PR and the communication level.
So how do you both see the international issues would be able to rally at least the supporter of China-U.S. relations getting better, be able to bring them still together? How much strength is really there, Professor Da?
I think we are facing a kind of struggling, of two things. One thing is deteriorating bilateral relations. The other is the demand of the cooperation, collaboration on global issues, and of course, including other issues like, for example, people-to-people tie. We already mentioned that. I mean, this is a struggle because, probably everybody will say, yes, the two countries should collaborate on those global issues and on those, people-to-people ties. But the bilateral relations, deteriorating bilateral relations, I think has had a very bad, very strong impact on those impact. I think if we can step into a kind of new normal that I mentioned, I think the two countries can become more mature. A mature bilateral relations, I think, includes that both sides admit that we are different, but we still need to, live in this, coexist in this world responsibly, working on those global issues jointly, and also maintain those less competitive side of the bilateral relations, like people-to-people tie, stronger. I think those are the part of the content in my new normal argument is.
There are many issues, as I outlined, that we can collaborate on that should be relatively uncontroversial. We had these expectations kind of pre-COVID that, for instance, a global pandemic was something that the two sides could collaborate on. We kind of lost that one as a potential area for collaboration. It was long held across the medical sciences that China-U.S. collaboration was critical and uncontroversial, and that, for instance, cures for cancer could never be truly developed without bilateral collaboration of clinical trials, of data sets, of scientists flowing cross-border. Climate is a very clear area of collaboration. The West, particularly the U.S., but the West more broadly, Europe, cannot meet its climate targets without a Chinese technology. And China is the global leader when it comes to most of the core inputs, be it solar panels or otherwise. And so there's still a clear role for the two sides to play there. We saw that playing out at COP28 in Dubai last month or so. So I think that still remains open. I do think there remain areas of collaboration. We need to define the guardrails. We need to define the areas where we are going to compete ferociously when it comes to technology, business, political interests, and then those that are sacred for all of humanity and therefore require cross-border collaboration.
One could argue that we might have some roller coaster situations throughout the year, but how to avoid there's not going to be a decoupling and also run out of tracks would be the ultimate goal that both sides need to work on. Final words from both of you, Ben.
Again, I'm pessimistic heading into 2024, but hopefully it provides clarity where the American public stands in its views on China, because I think they are often shouted out for the interests of political and economic elites in many of the borders in America, the kind of coastal elites. And I'd like to find a way to bring their voice back into the equation, understand how they can benefit from this relationship. As Professor Dawei said, stimulating the Chinese economy is one way to start that, because if there continues to be strong domestic demand here in China, that will create a more robust cross-border business flow. And that has usually been the kind of ballast, the stabilizing force in the U.S.-China relationship. And so my hope is that over the coming year, we establish a greater flow of goods and services that China is able to act upon, and America is able to accept that willingness for more cross-border human-to-human flows, particularly among students, and that we come out of this year with a more predictable, stable, and yet managed decoupling.
I see. Professor Da?
Yeah, I don't want to use pessimistic or optimistic to describe my view towards this year, but I think we need to avoid fatalism. I mean, everything depends on how do we, what do we do and how do we react to each other. I think if I have to use that word, I will say I'm cautiously optimistic about this year, I mean 2024. But having said that, I have to say this year's election in the U.S. is the biggest question mark for China-U.S. relations and probably for the whole world. I'm not talking about specific candidate, but I mean after the election, if the U.S. have a new administration, then the policy, the strategy towards China could change again. So this new normal, if it can happen this year, but I'm not sure if it can last till next year. So we have to wait and see. I hope we all have a good fortune.
All right. We need some fortune cookies, it seems. Well, thank you so much for both of you for sharing your thoughts about this very important bilateral relations. Ben Harburg, Dawei. Appreciate it, gentlemen. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, you can always search World Insight on our YouTube channel. You can also find us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.